In today's video, we're going to be hearing from hikers and hunters who detail bizarre and terrifying experiences out in and around the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But before we start today's video, be sure to go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for stories just like these. Let's go. I have a thing for going hiking alone, as I feel I can focus better and enjoy nature more without the distractions of talking or company. It's also safer, or so I prefer. I go hiking alone in the Smoky Mountains quite often. It's a very close drive from where I live. I usually go to Andrews Bald, as it's one of the more secluded areas in a very populated area. Today, I was feeling a bit more adventurous, so I decided to go to Twin Creeks Trail. It's a bit more secluded. I packed some fruit and water, made sure I had my mace, and headed out. I love being outside in nature, but this time I felt a bit uneasy. It was the same feeling you get when you are being watched, but there was nobody in sight besides me. I simply shrugged it off and kept walking. The first half of the trail is really nice. It's shaded and very well kept. But as you get closer to the end, or at least where I was going, it's much more overgrown, and the trees grow closer together. This is where I start to feel very uneasy, as I'm pretty sure I'm the only person around. I start to walk faster as I don't like the feeling that I get. That's when I noticed something ahead of me. It's very large, gray, and on all fours. I could see its face, which is more like a dog than anything. Its ears are all very tall and pointy, and its back is curved and has a very odd gait to it. I immediately stop as I'm not sure what this thing is. It notices me and stops as well, and we stand there for what feels like hours, and I'm too afraid to move. We make eye contact, and I start to hear a very faint sound like a howl. Only a few seconds later, it begins to howl back. This goes on for a few more moments, and now I'm too scared to move. So, a few seconds later, I decide I need to get out of there. I start to walk backwards as I don't want to turn my back on this thing. I get about halfway through, and lucky me, I trip on a rock. I start to get up, but now this thing begins to move toward me. I'm now too scared to move, so I just sit there and watch as it gets closer, getting ready to pounce. It hears a roar off in the distance, and it stops, looks off in that direction, and then back to me. It gives me an expression like it was angry, and then goes off in that direction. Was another one of these things calling to it? I don't know, but I'm grateful it left me alone. Once it was gone, I didn't waste any time getting out of there. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove home. It was a very frightening experience. I've been back since, but only during the day and with a large group of people. I want to know what I saw that day, but at the same time, I'm afraid of what I might find. I've attached a drawing of what I saw. It's not very good, and I'm sure it will help you in any way, but I felt I needed to let people know about my experience. What I saw, or what I drew, is pretty close to what I saw. I have a sighting that I don't know where to begin. I live in the country, and my property is fairly large. I have a creek bottom that goes through it, and there are areas of heavy woods on either side of the creek. I also have a small hill that is very close to my home, which makes it easy to see for miles. I own about 240 acres of hunting land, and my house and barn are in the bottom area. The rest is heavily wooded hillsides. I have two other houses on my property, one that I rent out when I can, and one that my brother occasionally rents out. My sighting was in the early morning, before daylight, actually. I was getting ready for work when I noticed my dogs were being very quiet. I could hear them sniffing around outside, but they weren't barking and excited like they usually are. I knew something was up. I got my gun and headed outside. My dogs were now nowhere to be found, but I could hear them going crazy on the hillside, right above my property. They were barking and carrying on. I walked to the edge and looked up the hill, where I could now see a blinding hot white light. In fact, it was so bright I had to squint my eyes. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what it was. It looked like the light from a helicopter hovering, but I couldn't hear any sound at all. Just my dogs barking and yelping. Immediately, I'm engulfed in this light now, and I begin to feel uneasy, to put it lightly. I'm trying to make out what the object is, but it's just too bright. All I can make out was a dark, large shape. I stood there for what seemed like forever, until I noticed my dogs had gone silent. Complete silence. And for some reason, I felt compelled to come toward the light. It's as if I was being drawn to it, and I couldn't fight whatever it was. When I reached the top of the hill, the light had simply vanished. I felt dazed and confused and could not make out what had just happened, as if time had gone by. It was still dark out, but just as I looked around to try and collect my bearings, I saw a figure standing on the other side of this hill. It's as I'll describe to you as best I can. A 7-foot-tall being, very broad shoulders and long arms. It had long black hair, but it was very thin, almost bony. The face was strange looking, like it was skeletal in nature. The creature was facing me, but slightly turned, as if it was listening to my dogs. I could only make out the front side of it, because I couldn't see anything else. It was wearing something that reminded me of an old-style suit with a tattered look to it. I looked over at my dogs, and then it looked over at me with a grimace. It wasn't there before the light had shown up. This being, or whatever it was, looked evil and made my blood run cold. To put it plainly, this thing looked disgusting. It turned and began to hover. I was frozen in fear. I could hear the dogs barking and snarling just over the hill where this thing had stood. Then, out of nowhere, my dogs come flying over and go right for this thing. It turned and looked at the dogs, then back at me and stood there. The dogs immediately started yelping out and crying as if something had happened to them. They came running back in this direction, bolting past me. I stood there for a moment or two until I could see the light from my own house. I walked home immediately after that. Well, the following morning, I checked on the dogs again, but they were gone. They never came back. I looked all over them, but they were just gone. I looked, and the following evening, I found them dead in the yard. They had been eaten on by something. I've never seen anything like this before, but I knew it had to be this thing that I saw, the way in which they were killed. But there wasn't a drop of blood. I know what I saw, and it was not a man. This was something else entirely. I'll never forget looking at this thing and remembering the way it made me feel. I know, this sounds crazy, but it's what I've experienced. I've seen this thing now 3 times since then, and I often hear strange sounds at nights, and have these horrific nightmares. Strange sounds like electrical whirring and other bizarre noises. It's been well over a year since this all happened, but I have a feeling it's still out there. In the early 1980s, my father and I were bow hunting for deer in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I don't recall the exact date, but it was just during the general deer season. The area we were hunting was on the Little River Trail. We were hiking down the trail, and my father was in the lead, and I was only about 15 yards behind him. Along the trail, we crossed a small stream by the way of stepping stones. As I stepped onto the 3rd stone, my right foot slipped, causing me to lose balance and falling into the stream. As I was getting up to brush the water, I noticed that the thick bushes on my right, where I'd been seconds before, were moving. At first, I assumed it was a deer or maybe a bear coming to investigate the commotion I had made, and the moving bushes were now followed by loud noises, almost like something big. I looked at my father, and he had a puzzled look on his face, as if I could read it in him saying, "What is that?" As we continued down the trail, being quickly ushered by my father, he kept turning around every few minutes to see if anything was following us. I thought this was strange. As we proceeded down the trail, I don't know if it was my imagination or what, but I could have sworn I saw something moving in the trees on both sides of the trail, like there were people or animals following us. The further we went, the stronger the feeling became. I never felt anything like that before or since. The feeling was so strong that I wanted to turn around and go back. That feeling, of course, made me a little leery of proceeding any further. My father and I decided to stop for a rest and have some much-needed nourishment. We had barely sat down when a deer came out of the woods on the left side of the trail and walked to the stepping stones. As it was drinking, my father and I both noticed the feeling of uneasiness getting much, much stronger. My father looks at me, and he says, "We need to leave now." I've never seen my father so scared before. He was practically shaking. We quickly gathered our things and started back down the trail as fast as we could. Before long, we were running, or should I say he was running and dragging me along. We didn't stop until we got back to the truck. We left immediately without even really unloading our gear. I had never seen my father act that way, and I knew he was scared. I didn't see anything, but the feeling was so strong that I knew something had to have been there. I believe that we were being followed by something. I believe it was after we had left the area for about 1.5 miles, I felt a little safer. I've never talked about this with anyone, but I've thought about it from time to time. I wonder what it was we may have saw or encountered. On the drive home, my father revealed to me that he saw it. He was extremely shaken up by this and would never go into detail on what it was. This was years ago, and my father basically refused to talk about it ever again after this. Come 2020, he got COVID and passed away, so I'll never have the answers. All I can say is that I know it was genuine, because I had the same feelings too. And if anything, we were definitely being followed by something that day. Something that was smart enough to stay hidden amongst the trees. Who knows what it had planned for us. This happened about 10 years ago. I was deer hunting with my cousin right around the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We were in a very heavily wooded area, about halfway of one of the sides. It was a very crisp November day, and we're walking, looking for deer. We didn't have to go very far. About 200 yards from the road, we came across a creek with a steep bank on our right. We decided to cross the creek at a shallow area and continue up the hill on the other side. About halfway across, I stepped on a dead log that was under the water instead of exposed. Instantly, I knew I was in trouble because my left foot snapped backwards. I fell to the ground and my cousin came over to see what had happened. He helped me up and we continued up on the hill. Once at the top, I took off my boot and sock to see what I had done to my foot. It was already turning black and blue, with a twisted ankle. Somehow, I was able to put weight on it and walk on it enough that I could actually maneuver. I did not have my cell phone with me, so my cousin decided that we would have to walk back down the trail to get the truck. I told him that I would be fine and tried to hobble down the trail. He soon realized how bad a shape I was and said he would have to carry me. We went down the trail and had only gone a short distance when we both saw something on the hillside to our right. Now, here's the story. It looked like a deer, so I didn't think too much of it. But then it stood up on 2 legs and looked right at us. I thought it was more than strange and even flabbergasted that this was happening. But my mind quickly changed when I realized it was not a deer, but it was appearing to change shape in front of us. The limbs on its body were growing and changing, much in the way that something would change shape and contort. And soon this deer, or what I thought was a deer initially, was growing taller and bigger, and its shoulders were broadening, and it appeared to have a very muscular body, and even the fur changed to a long brownish red. My first thought that came over me was a demon, but my cousin was terrified. Then it turned its attention away from us and moved back down the hillside, keeping up on 2 legs the entire time, continuing off to the other side. It never looked back. We made it back to the truck in double time, and I spent the rest of the afternoon getting my now broken ankle taken care of. Looking back, I still have no idea how I managed to maneuver how much I did on a severely broken ankle. Perhaps it was the adrenaline. As far as what I saw, I don't know. It's as if me and my cousin caught something or someone shape-shifting mid-form. I know that sounds absolutely crazy, but that's the best way I can describe it. I've thought about this encounter many times. And while I was even at the hospital getting my ankle looked at, one of the nurses was telling me about some really creepy stuff that's happened to her right around the same area where we had been hunting. I'd even asked her about Bigfoot, but She had no such knowledge of things existing. Her thing was more supernatural. The area in which we saw this thing, I guess a lot of other people have reported seeing Bigfoot in the area. I'm not sure how many people would be brave enough to stay overnight, although I'm sure there are many. I wouldn't have been if I hadn't already been there. Anyway, thank you for listening to my account.